the beginning, and I'll take full responsibility for that. Revelation chapter 1, we want to look at verse 8 to start off with. Keeping in mind all that we learned about creation and all that we have seen about creation, who was, and this is kind of an interesting question because there is multiple, right answers. Who was the actor in creation? Okay, the Word. And the Word was God, and the Word was with God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being by Him, and apart from Him, nothing came into being that has come into being. That actually is said at least twice that I know of in the New Testament. The one that we have reference to and that we just quoted from directly is, of course, John 1. John 1:14 says that Word who created all things was who? He became flesh and dwelt among us. And so, who became flesh and dwelt among us? That was God. We call Him Jesus. He was called Jesus. That name was given to Him by God. It was given to Him on His birth, or shortly before His birth, given to His parents. And so it's important that we keep in mind that the person that we think of as Jesus was in fact the eternal God who was acting at creation. And the things that we read about in Revelation are connected to that. And though the word creation is not used, an idiom is used that is supposed to connect our minds to at least that act, and really two acts. And so let's look at verse 8. I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord God, who is, and who was, and who is to come. The Almighty. We can take these things independent of one another, but I really just want to focus on the first phrase that's used there. I am the Alpha and the Omega. What in the world does that mean? Okay, the beginning and the end. Why does it mean the beginning and the end? Okay, so those are the first letters, the first and the final letter of the Greek alphabet. That is equivalent to saying I am the A and the Z to a group of English folk. And so when he says, or if you're from Great Britain, I guess it would be the A and the Z. But anyway, if we look at that, we got to understand that's an idiom. So it's not literally talking about the alphabet at all, and he's not saying that he is the first and last letters of the alphabet. What's he saying when he says that?
Exactly what he said in the next comment.
Which is the beginning and the end. Okay, so there's that aspect of it. That is the first and the last. He goes on to say in the next phrase, what? Who is and who was and who is to come. And so he's talking about his eternality. He is now, He was at the beginning, and He is to come. He is present in all times, both present tense, past tense, and future. And so what I understand when I read the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, not just the beginning and the end, I understand the beginner and the ender. Okay? And where that becomes important is because he's identifying himself as the Creator. I am the beginner. Yes?
What you said kind of brought to my mind that in the same way, God was the first to speak, and God will be the last, the first and the final word.
And there's significance in that phrase, being the first and final word. Carries with it not only the idea of presence and speaking, but the idea of what? Ultimate authority. If you're the final word, what does that mean? That's what matters. That's where the conclusion lies. And that's essentially what he's trying to carry out here. He's trying to draw our minds to the breadth of his existence. And by the way, it very much parallels the point of John 1 in the opening chapter, the opening verses of John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word was God, the Word was with God. Everything was created by Him. Apart from Him, nothing was created that was created. All of that language is incorporated in this idea of who is and who was and who is to come. That harkens back even to His conversation with Abraham, right? It harkens back to His conversation with Moses from the burning bush. Who should I say that has sent me? What was the response? I am has sent you. And so it's identifying who this is. And by the way, the very last word of the verse makes it perfectly clear. I am the Almighty. I am the first and the last. I am Him who is and Him who was and Him who is to come. I am the Almighty. And so the revelation is from the Creator of all things. And that gives credence and authority behind the things that are said within. Now, there's lots of things that we could draw from this book alone in connection with this, but we want to skip all the way back to chapter 21, toward the end of the book. This is a big section on the new heaven and the new earth and on the new Jerusalem and all of those things. And we want to look at verses 5, 6, 7, and 8. And we're going to see this same identifier set forth as a basis or foundation for the truth and the power to bring about all the things that are being talked about here. And He who was seated on the throne, which of course is indicating His authority, He who was seated on the throne said, Behold, I am making all things new. Also He said, Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. He said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give from the spring of the water of life without payment. The one who conquers will have this heritage. I will be his God, and he will be my son. But as for the cowardly, the faithless, the detestable, as for murderers, the sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. And so there's a contrast being set forth here. A contrast between those who are adopted as sons, those who conquer not just the difficulties of life, but what? The temptations of life. Are there temptations in life? What's one of the biggest temptations that we face in living in the flesh in this world? Okay, going after money. It's interesting that you say that. Guess what the sermon's going to be about this morning? Materialism. It's more than just going after money, though. And we're going to talk about it. We're going to develop this idea a little bit further in the next hour. One of the biggest problems with living in the flesh in this world is becoming consumed and focused on living in this world. Being a fleshly being. Our body is there. We see it in the mirror. We feel it hurt. We even feel it when it feels good, right? We feel pleasure. It's very present. It can't be ignored. But what about the spirit of man? Can it be seen? Is it easy to forget about the fact that I'm more than my body? Is it easy to forget about the fact that I'm more than my existence here in time? Is it easy to not be aware that there is something other than time? Now, I think that the Bible is clear that He sets in our heart eternity. But at the same time, life itself brings us to the point for very many of us, what? That we put eternity out of our thoughts and out of our mind. And replace it with continual thoughts about what? What shall we eat and what shall we drink and what shall we put on? Those immediate pressing things of the material realm. And that's a big problem that we have. And so He says to them, it's done. This is settled. This is the way that it is. It is trustworthy and true. You can write this down because it's trustworthy and true. It is done. And the foundation for that is, I am the Alpha and the Omega. The beginner and the ender. I'm the one who made you, and I'm the one who's going to take these things out. Where's the material world going to be one day? It's going to be destroyed. It's going to not exist. I'm the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty, I will give from the spring of the water of life without payment. Anybody who desires to drink of the water of life that flows from the Creator of the world can. Without payment should not be misunderstood to mean that it doesn't require anything on our part. Freely. Not freely in the sense that you don't have to do anything to go to it to drink it, but freely in the sense of what? You can have as much as you would like. It's been provided for you. There's a fountain that's opened up and there's information available, but what do you have to do? You have to go to the trough to drink. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. The way it's presented in the Bible is, there are some people who are so slothful that they're sitting before a plate of food and their hand is in the dish and they're unwilling to do what? To lift it to their mouth that they might eat it. That's picturing people who have this water of life that is freely flowing and that all they have to do is go drink to their fill, but it's too much to ask to go drink. He said anybody can come to the spring of the water of life. The one who conquers, who overcomes, who's willing to make that trek and to come to the fountain and to drink, the one who conquers will have this heritage. I will be his God and he will be my son. That's what it means to be adopted as children. The Bible talks about that. Being adopted as children. But as for the cowardly, for the faithless to what? Faithless is the opposite of what? Faithful. What is this talking about being faithless toward? Broadly it's talking about being faithless toward God. Being faithless toward His covenant that He has made with us. Being faithless toward any of the obligations that we have before God and through His covenant. Being faithless means that you don't do what? That you don't have any confidence in it and you don't act according to it. Being faithful means that you place full confidence in it and you act according to it. And so if you enter into a covenant with a person and you are faithful in that covenant, then you place value in the covenant, you place value in its words, you trust that you're going to receive what it promises to give you, and you therefore fulfill your obligations as spelled out under that covenant. In other words, you do the work so that you get paid. If we're talking about a commercial covenant. There are other kinds of covenants that have nothing to do with money, however. Maybe that'll present a better illustration. What about the covenant of marriage? There are promises that are made. To be faithful in your marriage means what? That you honor that covenant. That you respect those promises. That you keep the promises that you made. And you fulfill the obligations that arise from within that covenant. But to be faithless in your relationship means what? That you disregard the value of it. And you fail to rise up to meet your obligations. And so what it's talking about here is for people who fail to do what they're obligated to do before God. For the cowardly, for the faithless, people that are afraid to act. You remember the people of Israel when they stood on the edge of the Jordan and God said, go in, the land's yours, I've given it to you already, and they were afraid to go in? What happened to them? They spent 40 years wandering around aimlessly in the wilderness, and they died apart from the promises of God. They were cowardly. They wouldn't move forward because they were afraid. For the faithless, there are people out there who don't put any confidence in God, who don't put any confidence in His Word, who don't believe that He can actually do what He said that He will do, or that He will do what He said He will do. Whichever one doesn't really matter. Whether it's they don't believe that He can or they don't believe that He will, because they lack that confidence, which is all that faith means, they're afraid to act. For the cowardly, for the faithless, for the detestable, there are some folks out there who are just what? They're just detestable. They're just bad people. They just like evil. What about the people, for instance, of Noah's time? When God looked down upon the world in Noah's time, what did He see? Only evil continually. All the way down to their thoughts. Every thought and intent was focused on evil. These are detestable people. And we can get that way. Cowardly, faithless, detestable, murderers. Who was the first murderer? Cain killed Abel. It's a very short walk from being detestable to being a murderer. For the detestable, for the murderers, for the sexually immoral, when did multiple wives begin? Shortly after the story of Cain and Abel. Being faithless in a relationship that God said that a man shall leave his father and mother and shall cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one. Not the 3 or the 4 or the 24, but the two shall become one. For murderers, for the sexually immoral, for sorcerers, idolaters, all liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. The same authority lies behind that promise that lies behind the promise of life. And I will be his God and he will be my son. This is the heritage of those who come to me. I'll be their God. They'll be my sons. They'll receive an inheritance from me as sons. But for people who choose a different course, the exact same authority that can save us is also going to do what? Cast us into the second death. Which this very book identifies as what? The lake that burns with fire and brimstone. Hell. Which the book of Matthew says was prepared for the devil and his angels. Who are the messengers of the devil? I would suggest to you it's very possible that all the messengers of the devil are the cowardly and the faithless and the detestable among us, the murderers, the sexually immoral, the sorceries, the idolaters. People who choose to become of their father, the devil, rather than accept the relationship from our Creator. Who's going to win in the struggle against good and evil? That's the whole point of the book of Revelation, by the way. The entire point of the whole entire book is to tell us that no matter what it looks like in this world, no matter how bad it looks, no matter how much it looks like we're losing the war, it's already been won. Who's going to win? God. God and those who are His. We're the ones that are victorious. It's already settled. Why? Because I'm the Alpha and the Omega. I'm the beginner and the ender. That's the kind of power and authority that God has. And that's the kind of power and authority that we are provoking the anger of when we choose to be faithless toward Him. Turn over to chapter 22, the last chapter in this book and in your Bibles. Let's look together at verses 12 through 14. Behold, I am coming soon. Okay, here's a promise. This one who identifies himself as the Almighty that started talking way back in Revelation chapter 1 and said, I am the Alpha and the Omega, I am the beginning and the end, I am the Almighty. He says, I am coming soon, bringing my recompense with me to repay each one for what he has done. Based upon what can we believe that? I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. Blessed are those who wash their robes, so that they may have the right to the tree of life, and they may enter the city by the gates. Let's keep reading a little further. Outside, people who don't enter by the door, to use Jesus' language from the Gospel of John, outside are the dogs and the sorcerers and the sexually immoral. Do you notice any similarity between the language here and the language about those that will be cast into the second death from the previous chapter? The sorcerers, the sexually immoral, the murderers, the idolaters, everyone who loves and practices falsehood. It's the same list. We have a choice about what we want to be and where it's going to place us. And it's as certain as the one who presented it to us. How do we know that sexual immorality is wrong? God told us, right? If we just look at the world, what does it suggest? And we're going to exclude humans for a moment. We are humans. We're trying to figure out how we should behave. If we look to the world, what does the world say to us about sexual relations among creatures? Is there any concept of marriage among animals? Among insects? Among the birds? There are a few that scientists that study these things suggest are monogamous and lifelong partners. That's such a weird thing that they make a big deal out of that. If we look just to the world, we're not going to come to the conclusion that we shouldn't engage in that kind of promiscuity. In fact, we're going to conclude that it's probably good for mankind for us to do what? Reproduce with as many people and as often as we can. That's how we raise our cattle, right? That's how we raise our sheep. We don't pair them off as a husband and wife and just get the offspring from the pairs. We turn the bull loose to the whole herd in the hopes that the bull is going to do what? Impregnate as many of them as possible. We're going to get as many calves from that sire as we possibly can. God's the one that told us sexual immorality put you outside, separate you from Him. And that's one of the problems we have in the world today. There are too few people who are turning to what God has said to get moral direction. And they are looking at the beast of the field and saying, well, if they do it, then it must be okay for us. And what God says about that in His revelation is that we're acting like unreasoning animals. Should we act that way? Should we not be able to see that there's a distinction between us and the rest of creation? That we have an awareness, a concept of right and wrong, of morality that the beast doesn't have? We all know that what's a man's best friend? Say it louder. The dog. Everybody knows that. Dog is the man's best friend. We love our dogs, right? We take care of our dogs. We feed them well. We give them everything that they need. And they would, without a second and with no pang in their, I'm going to put this in really heavy quotes, emotions. Put that in quotes because I'm not convinced animals have emotions, because they don't have a spirit the way that man does, created in the image of God. They have no pangs to steal the steak off of your plate and eat it. It doesn't make them feel bad. Why? It's just what they do. They eat. They don't have a concept of it being wrong to eat if it belongs to someone else. Because in their mind, what? If it's there and it's not being eaten by something else, then I'm going to eat it. They also, and I hate to, cats are worse than dogs about this particular thing, but I think dogs will do it too. Talk to your police officer friends. Or talk to your medical examiner friends if you have any. We used to have somebody that was a member here that worked in the medical examiner's office. Fortunately, they've moved on. But anyway, talk to them and find out when people die in homes that have pets, if they stay there long enough, you know what the pets end up doing? They have no problem with that. They don't mind feeding off of your corpse. They don't go, wait a minute, been a good owner, shouldn't do that. I should show respect to that body. They're hungry. Yeah. They're hungry and they eat. They'll also bite their master under the right circumstances. It's just the way that they are. They function by habit and by instinct. They don't think and reason. And so we shouldn't look to them and say, wait a minute, they'll run around the neighborhood and produce offspring with any female dog or any male dog that they can find. And so that must be the way that we can live. No, that's not how we make such judgments. We have an inherent awareness of eternality and a general understanding that there needs to be a source. Well, guess what? I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. And this is what I'm telling you. Sexual immorality is wrong. That from the beginning, I made the male and female and I partnered them together. That a man should leave his father and mother and should cleave to his wife, and the two should become one. And that's the way it ought to be. Yes.
In the beginning, it's not so. In the beginning, you had Adam and Eve. Why didn't you have Jack and Jill? Also,
Because He made them male and female.
and that, in the beginning, when God allowed brothers and sisters to have children, that changed. It's just like the Old Testament changed with the New Testament. The Old Law, the New Law, it was so in the beginning, but
Okay, well, you bring up a good point. A very good point. There was the patriarchal age, in the way in which God dealt with man in the patriarchal age, and then He made a covenant through Moses. And did things change under the covenant with Moses? Yeah, there were more regulations that were given. There were more obligations that were given. There were laws that were put into place and particular ways in which you approach God at that point. No longer was a man free to approach God directly, but now he has to do what? If he's a Jew, he has to go through the priest. That's all paving the way, by the way, for Christ and our understanding of the role of Christ as a mediator between God and men. But that notwithstanding, to the one born as a descendant of Israel, if he was faithless to the covenant that God made with those people, he didn't respect that. Now he's made a new covenant through his Son. And if we're faithless to Him, guess what? We don't respect that new covenant. Did things change between the covenant made through Moses and the covenant made through His Son? Certain things did. Why? Well, because the priesthood changed. And because the sacrifice changed. Because the outcome changed. In the covenant made through Christ, there's absolute forgiveness. We don't have to offer a sacrifice year after year after year through the high priest, because our high priest went into heaven and offered his own blood. And sins were once for all dealt with. And so we have this new covenant that if we're faithful to, we're adopted as children, and He delivers us and spares us from the consequences of sin. If we're not, if we are faithless, if we reject it, if we choose to approach Him however we want to, if we determine to be willful, if we want to be liars, we're on the outside. And we have our part in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone. The same authority that spoke the world into existence spoke those words, made that covenant, and therefore we can say it is done, it is going to happen, it is as certain as we are here today that when He calls all things to an end, He will do what He has said. He will come with His recompense and repay each one for what he has done. Yes, sir.
We know that God's faithful to do that because in the all along the way as God was maturing mankind, he constantly along the way told them what He would do if they did certain things, and He always honored that.
Yeah, God is consistent. I am the beginning and the end. So it will be, as I have said. You can trust my words. You can write them down. In fact, in Moses' case, he was instructed to write them in stone, literally. It wasn't going to change. And so we have to understand that the basis of all of our understanding pertaining to authority, pertaining to life, pertaining to judgment, pertaining to understanding why we should care what the Bible has to say about what is right and what is wrong. Would we have any way of knowing that being dishonest to someone, lying to them, deceiving them, would be wrong, except God told us? And except God showed us the consequences of such behavior? Would murder be wrong, except it was revealed to us that we should not do it? We would have no basis on which to draw that conclusion. What would be the right for me to take another life? Because I can. Because I have the strength and the power and the will to do it. If all that mattered was the material world, that's how it would function. But God has made known to us that we're more than our bodies. That He formed our bodies out of the dust of the ground and then breathed life into us. And we became a living being. And in fact, the first thing He told about us was that He said among Himself, let us make man after our image in our likeness. Of what else in all creation did God say that? Nothing. Now, this gets to another interesting thing. When we look purely to this world, the result is the cry that you hear and hear often today. It's the arrogance of man that makes him think that he's better than everything else. Not at all. It's the revelation of God that lets me know that I have something that the rest of creation doesn't have. I have the imprint of the image of God. It's not arrogance on my part. It's recognition of what He has done and what He has told us. Would we have any way of knowing that, by the way, if He had not told us? If Genesis 1 wasn't there, would we understand? And the answer is no. And we would have no basis for any authority to be placed. And by the way, I'm convinced that the authority of Jesus rests upon that same thing, which is why the Gospel of John begins by letting us know that the one who came in the flesh and dwelt among us was the actor at creation. That's the basis for which understanding. His right to come, His right to do what He said, His right to do what He did, His right to mediate a new covenant. We are His. Isn't that what Paul argued to the folks in Athens? As some of your own poets have said, we are His offspring. Being then the offspring of God, we ought not to think about God in a material way. See, the understanding of all of these things gives us the basis for accepting and understanding everything else in Revelation. And apart from it, we are going to be in trouble. And that is why it is such a terrifying thing for someone to reject creation and accept the concept of evolution. Because when you do that, you undermine the entire authority upon which every piece of revelation that we have from God is based. You take Genesis 1 out of the Bible, and the rest of it doesn't matter anymore. Any questions or comments before we move on? Anything? Anybody want to add anything? Yes, sir.
I was just wondering if you could develop the idea that this is the second time in the last two verses that we looked at where sorcery is mentioned. Can you develop that concept? What are you talking about there?
Yeah, and I can, and I'm gonna kind of go out on a limb a little bit to do this because I have not looked at the specific language that's used there for sorcery. What is that? That's what I want to find out, if that's actually the word that's used. Let me move there in this, which I can do, and I can get that answer. That's Revelation 22, verse 14, 15, 16, somewhere about in there. The sorcerers. Yes, it's pharmakos. Anybody know the word that is in our English language today that most derives from that Greek word pharmakos? Pharmacist or pharmacy. And so what that had to do with were people who practiced what is sometimes called the magic arts, which in large part were connected with what? We still have this imagery in our stories today, our fairy tales today. Potions. Witches get around a cauldron and they put stuff in the cauldron and they cook it and they bring it to a potion, and then they can use that potion to accomplish their purposes. What it basically is talking about is people that try to manipulate and control others' behavior through what we would call the magic arts, or through what in reality was drug manipulation. Love Potion number 9, what year was that song popular? Was that in the 50s or the 60s? 50s. Love Potion number 9. Today we call it Rohypnol. Anybody know what Rohypnol is? On the street, anybody know what they call Rohypnol? The date drug, the date rape drug. It was using pharmaceuticals to get people to do things that they wouldn't do on their own. Yes, sir.
I was just also thinking about, and you hear a lot of it today, where people use them for spiritual experiences.
Recreational, private use of such things to get your desires and wills accomplished and to create joy for yourself apart from the morals and the righteousness and the association we have with our Creator. That's what a sorcerer was. And that's what people today who recreationally use drug and alcohol are all about. I want to forget my pains and sorrows, so I turn to what? I turn to that potion, that magic elixir that will help me forget. Is that healthy? Is that the way that God would have it? No. And people who use material things for that purpose, he's classifying with the dogs. And by the way, we're not talking literally about dogs in this verse. We're talking about people who what? Who are detestable. Who have no value system.
The Old Testament calls useless individuals.
Unreasoning animals is what I think Jude refers to it, is acting as unreasoning animals. And so all of these things are important in our understanding. We're not free to act however we want to act. We're governed by the one who made us. And so we should seek to know what he expects of us. That's the point in all of these things. Got to stop. Appreciate your comments and your presentation. I mean your presence and your presentation of ideas that I did not